Before we get started, I just really want to say how humbled I always am to appear on a stage with Charles Reagan Wilson. He has been my teacher, my colleague, and a close friend for 20-something years, 20 years at least now. He originally brought me to the Center for the Study of Southern Culture in 2003 to work on the new Encyclopedia of Southern Culture, which is a 24-volume encyclopedia. And I think the last time we were here at the Louisiana Book Festival, I was looking at the old posters and was almost shocked to see that they were from 2012 and 2013, that we were here doing much of this same kind of thing. But this session today is about Charles. I am just here to throw out questions because he is someone who has shaped the field of Southern studies, has written a lot of the, anytime you see a book on Southern culture, you're going to see Charles's name in the footnotes. One day we will be doing panels on Charles Reagan Wilson, I think. But so when he did bring me to the Center for the Study of Southern Culture in 2003, little did I know that he was already working on this book. And so that's where I think I'd like us to start, is to ask Charles, and thank you for having me at this table with you today, but to talk a little bit about the history of this book, where it comes from, and then what its theme is, what its central idea is.
Okay. Thank you, Jimmy. I should bring him along more often. Thank you for those wonderful comments. You are indeed such a good friend and colleague, and we've worked together so well for so long. It's so easy to work with Jimmy, and so I'm glad that you're here to in dialogue with me. So I started this book in 1989. We had just finished work on the Encyclopedia of Southern Culture. The original idea was I would write a narrative that sort of synthesized a lot of stuff about Southern culture. I did 3 chapters. I was on a sabbatical, and then the sabbatical ended, and I went back to teaching, and I realized I wasn't ready to write that book, for whatever reason. And so I put it aside and worked on other things, and it never got out of my head, though. And so I would work on it, do research when I had an off hour with nothing pressing. And anyway, I retired 9 years ago, which is hard to believe. But and so I decided that's what I wanted my retirement project to be. And it's great to have a retirement project. Academics are lucky in that when they retire, it's like a permanent sabbatical, because you have time to do research and writing and all of that. So I started in on it, and I had to realize, that'd been a long time since I'd worked on it. So I had to reconceptualize it and use some of what I'd written before, but not a lot. But anyway, so it took me a while to discover what a book called The Southern Way of Life was supposed to be about. It could be about anything, really, or it could be about too much. That was the danger, too, I think. So anyway, what I concluded, and this is after really a career of thinking about the Southern culture and working on it in different ways, the encyclopedias, I got into the kind of details of Southern life with specific topics and all of this, and politics and economics and all that. Well, this book, I deal with some of those in some ways, but it's not about any of those. It's about culture, but I argued there were 3 concepts at the heart of the Southern identity. The book is really about the Southern identity, how Southerners came to think of themselves as Southerners, and people in other parts of the country and the world thought of this identity as Southern. So my argument is that thinking about the South about regional identity has gone through 3 concepts. The first is Southern civilization. That civilization concept was born in the Enlightenment, which was not long before white Europeans came to America, and they brought the concept with them, including to the South. And so white Southerners who came to the South tried to overlap civilization with a slave society. That was their particular society that evolved in the South. And so that was Southern civilization. And enslaved people, so white Southerners became Southerners partly through their subjugation of Native Americans and expulsion of them. And that gave them the land to make the Cotton Kingdom. But it also involved the enslavement of Africans to do the work to build Southern civilization. So Southern civilization came into conflict with American civilization that had been born during the American Revolution of free labor and free soil, all of this. Civil War was a great conflict of test, and Southern civilization lost. So you might have imagined it would vanish, but that concept didn't vanish. It was reimagined. In the late 19th century, white Southerners decided the key to their civilization was an apartheid society where they would have power and African Americans would live in a segregated society, disfranchised, suffering all sorts of other problems. So that became the reimagined post-Civil War around the lost cause narrative of ennobling the Confederacy. Well, the civilization concept in general fell into disrepute after World War I, with the horrors of that war making it hard to believe in civilization in general. And that coincided with the change leading to the second concept at the heart of an evolving regional consciousness. The second concept was the Southern way of life. Now, that term, you might think went back forever because it's a very familiar term. But when I got to doing research, I discovered it had not really been used in any widespread way until one particular book. In 1930, a group of intellectuals associated with Vanderbilt University published I'll Take My Stand. And in it, they argued that they used that term 33 times, I counted, 33 times. And to them, the Southern way of life was agrarianism, which they saw under attack by industrialization, industrial society. So they put that term into common usage and made it in the psyches of both Southerners and non-Southerners. But that continued until the 1950s. And so the term Southern way of life could mean agrarianism. It could mean other things. In that mid-20th century period, it could mean a well-mannered society, a leisurely society. It could mean a religious society. It could mean the South's business people. If you went to a Rotarian club, they presented a particular business version of the Southern way of life. But in 1954, something happened that changed this usage of the term, clarified it. And that was the Brown versus Board of Education decision requiring the desegregation of the public schools. So that led to an outpouring of literature led by the White Citizens Council in Mississippi, talking in new ways, emotional ways, about the precious Southern way of life, the sacred Southern way of life. So that made this a popular term as part of the resistance to social and racial change in the South. And that became the best known usage of the term Southern way of life. When I was a kid, if I had thought about it, I would have thought that's what everybody was meaning by the Southern way of life. Well, that continued until the Civil Rights Movement, and the challenges to that led to the overcoming of segregation, disfranchisement, Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965. So the use of that term Southern way of life went into a drastic decline after 1965. White Southerners no longer wanted to be associated with a racialized version of that. But you might think the term vanished altogether, but you would be surprised that it did not. It was reimagined. So what happened in 1966 that led to what I think is the third concept that structured thinking about regional consciousness? Well, here it is. A new magazine was published in 1966, Southern Living Magazine. So that's the third concept, is Southern living. Now, what was significant? Well, 1965 Voting Rights Act. 1 year later, there's a new magazine about the South, a popular magazine. And what happened is the Southern identity moved to the suburbs and became middle class and became more prosperous, became more tied in with the rest of the nation and less purely regional. So Southern Living is a prescriptive magazine. It tells you how to be Southern. You know, they have classic things like, Southerners love to eat pimento cheese. Southerners sure know how to make good biscuits. So that concept of Southern living became the third concept. Now, I think in the 21st century, there's been a evolution from that. In my last chapter, it's called a multicultural South. and that deals with the greater diversity that we have in the contemporary South, and how that has worn away at this earlier kind of unitary versions of what a Southern civilization or Southern way of life would be. So in a nutshell, that's my argument, with those three concepts are at the heart of the book.
I was just wondering, just thinking, thinking about these three different parts. Was there ever any other? We've never talked about this, so.
Okay, he's hitting me with something new.
Yeah. Was there ever any other way you thought about dividing this book up?
Well, I'm in.
Sorry.
No, that's good. That's a great question. And I've written elsewhere about other aspects of the South, and so I could have done a book called The Southern Way of Life that would argue to explore the localism, that there were, what is the South in South Louisiana compared to Appalachia, compared to South Florida and Miami, compared to West Texas, where I grew up, So that would be a way of saying this Southern way of life, instead of a unity, it would be Southern ways of life. And I played around with that a little bit. But what was so compelling to me is that historically that term provided conceptually for white Southerners who favored it, for African American Southerners who critiqued this racialized version of the Southern way of life that was dominant. And it also was a compelling term for non-Southerners who like to think about the South and stereotype the South often. And so that term became compelling, especially because I was interested in regional consciousness, and to me that was the thing. And so that I decided not to do the Southern ways of life and to do the Southern way of life.
And you've done so much work on Southern religion, Lost Cause in particular, started out your first book. And we can't really even think about the Southern way of life without thinking about religion. I think it's tied to all of these three parts. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind talking about that just a bit. And then whatever other cultural aspects of these Southern ways of life, or the Southern way of life. What are these components of that?
I think religion is really a key, and you're right, from far back in Southern history. Now, there's one particular religious tradition that has dominated the South, evangelical Protestantism. And it's the religion of sin and salvation and revivalism, and we're very familiar with the images of this. It goes back to the turn of the 19th century with the Cane Ridge revivals in Kentucky that launched the growth of particular denominations, the Methodists, the Baptists, Pentecostals, and others. And that became the driving force in the conversion of the frontier, and then later after the Civil War, and when this variety of Southern religion became so associated with Southern folklore and folk culture and institutional. The Baptist and the Methodist and the Presbyterians in the South had originally been part of national denominations in the early 19th century, but in the 1840s, they split to form the Southern Baptist Convention, the Southern Methodist Church, and the Southern Presbyterian Church. They split before the nation's political institutions split, and indicating the power of this religion in the region. And they didn't reunite. The Presbyterians didn't reunite until the 20th century, the Methodists in the 1930s, and the Southern Baptist Convention is still the Southern Baptist Convention. Baptists in particular have always had a very strong imprint in the South. Now, of course, there were a variety of Baptists. There's the Southern Baptist Convention, Primitive Baptist, Missionary Baptist, lots of Baptists. Indeed, in the South, there are more Baptists than people. But religion became tied in with the defense of the Confederacy and the memory of the Confederacy, and it created a kind of civil religion that said that there was some kind of sacred meaning in the Southern historical experience, in Southern culture itself. And so the Confederate monuments were clothed in this divine sanction that made it very difficult for any kind of questioning of the narrative about the lost cause, or for any other alternative narrative to be allowed in discussions in Southern culture until very recently. And so religion not only institutionally was important, but it became tied in with the memory of the Southern past, and a way to give divine sanction to segregation and to all of the aspects of Southern life.
Yeah.
And okay,
Sure.
you asked about other aspects of culture, and so I want to mention some of those. You don't think of sports in particular in terms of concepts about the South, but it's so associated with the South and have been for a very long time. Of course, in the 19th century, when you say sports, you'd be talking about recreational things like fishing and hunting. But in the 20th century, organized sports became commercialized. And that's what happened in the 20th century with Southern culture and the Southern way of life, is it became commercialized and commodified. You had a wonderful, rich folk music in the rural areas especially, but also in cities. And that folk music evolved in the 1920s and 30s into blues music and country music, gospel music, and other forms of music that became the embodiment for many people of Southern culture itself. And the same with sports. You know, football was very slow to catch on in the South. It was a New England game. The Ivy Leagues were the first to play football, and then the Midwest. But it was in the 1920s that the Southern football became a national power. And I hate to say it, but the University of Alabama was the school that embodied this. Marie and I saw this T-shirt today. It was in LSU colors, and it said, "Imagine America without Alabama." Well, in 1926, let me find this here. In 1926, the University of Alabama beat UCLA in the Rose Bowl. And that launched Southern football into this new level of prominence in which so much has been invested culturally in that. But it wasn't just football, it was also baseball. Now, Dizzy Dean, many of you will remember Dizzy Dean. You wouldn't think of him as an intellectual who embodies concepts of the South, and he didn't. But he represented another aspect of that Southern way of life, which was the performance aspect. Because if you looked and listened to Dizzy Dean, he embodied the South in his language, his accent, his vocabulary, his loquaciousness, his love of Southern food, all of these things. He was the walking embodiment of the South for Southerners and for other people in the country as well. You also had South is a storytelling place. I asked Eudora Welty one time why there were so many great writers in the older rural South, and she said, "Honey, there wasn't anything else to do." Well, that's an exaggeration, undoubtedly, but she, in her wonderful memoir, One Writer's Beginnings, she talks about that older South in Jackson, Mississippi. On Sunday afternoons, she would go riding with her mother and her mother's best friend in the car, and she would get in, fluff her skirt down, sit between those two ladies, and say, "Now start talking." And that's, I think, sort of functionally what happened is this storytelling oral tradition became rooted in the writing of these writers who heard these stories and translated them into these written stories as well. Not only are there are the conceptual ideas I talked about, there's the performance aspect, as in sports and other things. There's also the symbolic or material culture, the material South, material Southern way of life. And this is seen partly in church fans. So I have a big collection of church fans, as Jimmy knows, and I brought some today to illustrate this. Now, the original fan, this is, of course, to fight the heat. So fans are popular in any kind of culture that has hot temperatures. The original fans were the palm fan. And you found this song in Southern culture. This one is, though a commercialized one. It says, "The Klinger Funeral Home, licensed lady embalmer." There you go. So my idea is that these fans, the images are the Southern image of heaven, because they're all very peaceful scenes. This is a scene of a church autumn scene, colors turning on the trees, a little pond. says Chapel by the Lake, and on the back it says Standard Life and Casualty Insurance Company, Rock Hill, South Carolina, known for its prompt, friendly claim service. So the Southern idea of heaven. Imagine you're in a hot Louisiana church in the summer. Surely heaven is this cool mountain scene. So these cardboard fans came into being in the early 20th century when printing companies figured out the technology to do lithography and chromolithography. And they could reproduce incredible scenes like the Last Supper on a cardboard fan and then stick them on a stick. And so printing companies would sell these in large lots, like $500 at a penny a piece, and businesses of any kind could buy them and distribute them. Typically, it was funeral homes and insurance companies, and they would buy them, give them to the churches. Churches would put them in the pew, and so every Sunday you would think about death, you know, when you see the fans. Often very sacred. Here's Jesus in Garden of Gethsemane. Back of this says, Sam Carroll Memorials, builder of fine monuments, Andalusia, Alabama. Of course, any business could buy these and project their images, and the commodification of this. This is a very sacred scene, but on the back it says, stop, rest, eat, and sleep at Howard's Snack Bar and Motel, New Albany, Mississippi. Fighting the heat was very much a biracial thing, and this is an important theme in the Southern way of life. You know, it was hyper-racialized and segregated, but the other side of this was the biracial tradition that rested in the experiences of everyday life, of interaction, and this is a good example. Two little girls, these are fans, and on the back, this one says, go to church, right to the heart of it. This is the Standard Burial Association, the House of Williams & Williams Ambulance Service, day or night in Natchez, Mississippi. And this one is the Keeshan Funeral Home, and its big claim to fame, if you were somebody needing the services of a funeral director, this was from the 1950s. The history of air conditioning, which a scholar named Raymond Arsenault has written, informs us that it was the 1950s when air conditioning came widespread into small businesses. The back of this says, air-conditioned ambulance. I mentioned the biracial theme. Much of the imagery of African Americans in the early 20th century was very demeaning and stereotyped. But these fans, of course, went into African American churches. And so the imagery on these fans are really quite striking about very positive imagery. This one is classic. It says, quick snack. And it's an African American mother pouring a glass of milk for a little boy with a baseball bat. American story. So these fans went out of the churches, and again, because of the heat, you find them now anywhere there's an event outdoors. This is from a watermelon festival, Little League baseball game. Are you a tomato fan? We put celebrities who embody aspects of the Southern way of life, as in music. Here's Minnie Pearl. And on the back it says, howdy, as she always would. Here's Mahalia Jackson. Dr. King is surely one of the most common figures on fans in African American churches. Here's Scarlett on a Stick, Scarlett O'Hara. And I couldn't talk about the Southern way of life without talking about Elvis, so this is an Elvis fan, it says. It's a little limp now, but. So, yes, Jimmy, there are all sorts of cultural kind of manifestations that we see from studying the Southern way of life.
Do you know how many fans you own now?
About 550.
550.
Yeah, that's my next
Wow.
project, in fact, is I've made an inventory of the fans. I'm going to give them to the University of Mississippi Archives eventually, but hopefully I'm going to do a kind of picture book of the fans, and with the images on the front on one page, and then on the back what the text is, because it's kind of a documentary project to document what's on the back, and to the book. If it's a book, it would be called Church Fans, and it would talk about the intermingling of sacred and the secular in the South, because the church aspect and the death aspect evokes sacred, but they're commodified. You know, businesses buy them, and you got all sorts of messages in the back that don't relate to religion or whatever. So, that's my next project.
I look
I hope it
forward to
doesn't take as long to do that as
Yeah.
it took to do this.
I'm sure it won't. One of the great things about this book is the way it's divided up into 3 sections, but then each of the sections is divided into smaller chapters. I don't have a page marked here, but this one is Culture and Way of Life, Atlanta Compromise, with a church. I opened to an illustration of a church fan, Booker T. Washington. But I think that I love the way it's broken up because you can just open this book up and just read on African American folk culture and so forth, Dixiecrats. But, one of the strengths of this book or of any book is the fact that you tell stories. There are anecdotes and good examples drawn from actual occurrences and so forth. I wondered if there are any stories that you've included in this book that you are particularly fond of. I don't know, just some instances in history that you decided you had to include that was really representative of what you were doing in this book.
Great question. So in a lot of, if you took one idea away from the book in many ways, it is that it tries to document the diversity of the South. It used to be that people thought of the South as a kind of fixed entity, unchanging. Time was totally traditional and all of this. And my book is that's not the way it ever was. The South was always contested and change was always happening. But the whole book is about the stories that different groups told themselves about the South. And it begins early on, with Native Americans. Native Americans have often been left out of Southern history. You study them, people study them, scholars study them as archaeologists or anthropologists or maybe historians talking about the colonial South. And then the Indians vanished from Southern historical study after that. But one story I found that I love that I think suggests something of trying to include a diverse group was about the Indian origin stories about their tribes. And one of my favorite is the tribe in southern Louisiana, near here. And the origin story of the tribe is that a crawfish dove down into the muddy Mississippi River and brought up dirt, and that became the origins of the state of Louisiana and the state of the Indian tribe. So I'm glad I could tell that story here. That's one story. I tried to include not only very prominent figures, I have a lot about critiques of the South by African Americans, extensive sections on W.E.B. Du Bois, excuse me, and Richard Wright, Zora Neale Hurston, but also figures who are not as well known. One of my favorite is the story of Catherine Dupree Lumpkin. Now, Lumpkin was a member of a prominent Georgia family, plantation family, during the Civil War. And her father had been a prominent Confederate officer, and he never got over the loss of the Civil War. So she grew up in this world of the Lost Cause. She was a member of the Children of the Lost Cause. There was not only the daughters of the Confederacy, there were the children of the Confederacy. And she wrote a wonderful book called The Making of a Southerner in 1949. It's one of the best books about the Southern identity. Some of you know it. And so the first half of it is written kind of almost from the father's perspective about what he was trying to teach the children about the Lost Cause and that it was sacred and don't ever change, never, never, ever change. But then the second half of the book is how she escaped that sort of stifling influence. And how did she do it? This is, to me, a fascinating study of people in that older South who managed to escape the incredible pressures toward orthodoxy. So Lumpkin was a religious person. She was an Episcopalian. She learned that from her family. But the version of that she adopted was a kind of social justice version of Episcopalianism. She went to a small small college in middle Georgia, where she received a good liberal arts education that broadened her horizon. She became active in working in the YWCA, which in the early 20th century was a prime focus for interracial work and for supporting women's work in public work and culture. And she saw this woman named Miss Arthur who came and gave a talk. She was an African-American woman. And one of the organizers invited her back to have tea and cookies with Miss Arthur. Well, if you know anything about the segregated society, interracial eating was only slightly below interracial sex. You just didn't do it. And she said she was so scared, she was terrified. And she had the tea and the cookie, and the world didn't end. And she got to be friends with Miss Arthur, and they became active working. She goes on to get a PhD in sociology. She works in the labor movement in the South. So it's a fascinating study. She's not well known enough, I think. And so that kind of story was one that I wanted to highlight of somebody not as well known.
I imagine that after a career of doing this kind of work, you've accumulated a memory bank full of these kinds of stories. What were some of the, were there any stories that you couldn't put in, that you just said, I've already got an example of this, I've got to choose between these kinds of examples, and this book, it's a massive book. What is it, 660 pages?
Yeah.
But then again, like I say, it's easily digestible. The chapters aren't just they're big chapters, but they're divided well. But were there any stories that you didn't put in, or what kind of challenges do you have when you're trying to write this kind of comprehensive book?
Oh, so many. I mean, I hate to say it in Louisiana, but Huey Long is not in there. I wrote about Huey Long, and then I realized it didn't really connect to the conceptual ideas that I was wanting to emphasize. And I'd written it, and and it was just wonderful prose, and I just hated to give it up, But I realized it didn't fit. So there was that constant kind of thing, and especially with culture, because I wrote another book recently called The American South, a short introduction in a series about short introductions to different topics. And that was more of a real cultural history, and I dealt not only with history, but I have a chapter on foodways and on music and on literature. Well, there's not enough music in here, Jimmy. I'm sorry, So you need to put on some, James Brown and Hank Williams while you read it to give you that Southern cultural kind of oral dimension. But anyway, the point is, I wrote things about some musicians, but it just didn't fit, And but some of it I used in that shorter book, like Ray Charles. I wrote a nice paragraph about Ray Charles and how he embodied the convergence, how soul, his version of soul music and R&B came out of gospel music. He was in the church very much, and then that kind of evolved. But it didn't really fit exactly with this kind of conceptual history I was doing. So there was a lot of that kind of frustration, and I cut out a lot of discussion of, like Zora Neale Hurston I went on endlessly about, but the editor finally said, this is too much, you just have to cut. And so again, it's that kind of trying to figure out what to put in and what to leave out.
Did you cut much from the original manuscript?
Yeah, I did.
A little bit?
I did. I can't tell you how many words exactly, but it was quite a bit in the end.
That generally happens with most books.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, I'm thinking about the Southern way of life in particular. And I wonder, we see, when I was a kid, we would go to New Orleans. I'm from the Mississippi Delta originally. We would go to New Orleans and we'd get very excited. The first place we would go would be Popeyes. We'd go to Popeyes. Because that's the only place you could get Popeyes fried chicken. And it was, of course, the best fried chicken. But now you can go anywhere, probably outside of the United States, all over the world, and get Popeyes. And I'm wondering about this Southern, specifically the Southern way of life, and how the Southern way of life or its culture is being exported to other parts of America. And what that I mean, with television and the internet, you can get Southern culture pretty easily now. You don't have to come to Baton Rouge or New Orleans or the Mississippi Delta and places. But what does that mean for this idea of the Southern way of life? Is America becoming more Southern? Is the South becoming more American? How does that work? And what does that mean for this idea?
I think the nation adopts the worst parts of Southern culture. I think it means that the South and the nation are drawing closer together.
Mm-hmm.
The boundaries are often blurred. I think the South, and I look at the South in an American and a global context, and it always has been true, all the way back to the settlement of America as a global process that brought the planters and the enslaved people here to begin with, and exploited the indigenous people. And so all of that it's long been true, but certainly since the 1960s, the South is more part of the nation, and regional culture has been worn away. I saw a story the other day that was all around the national press about there's a study that the Southern accent is disappearing among the youngest Southerners, and so that that happens. That is happening. I think that the nation does it. It knows about the South, but to study these concepts. At first, I was only going to look at what Southerners thought about the South, and I realized that there's a kind of school of regionalism called critical regionalism that says to understand the concept of any region, you need to look at all the uses of it, not just the dominant use. And so I realized I need to look at the American, more generally, what people who are not from the South who thought about these concepts. And in general, my conclusion was they reverberate between two views of the South, one positive and one negative, both extreme. The positive version is sort of can be the Moonlighted Magnolias. It can be, the South is the source of a kind of supposed authenticity in a country that is constantly changing and traumatic and in chaos, and all of this. And the South is this peaceful sort of rural, pastoral, still these images, even though we're so not like that anymore. But the other version, that's positive. The negative version is the kind of besiegement image, the benighted image. The South is backward, and that's negative. My favorite recent example of this that I talk about is a book by Chuck Thompson, who is an ESPN reporter who wrote this book. He's a Northerner, and he wrote about the South. It's called Better Off Without Him. And it argues that the nation would be better if the South seceded and left. And he talks about, the South doesn't do well with its public schools, they're underfunded, public health system is not good, on and on. Well, I was on the program with him in Atlanta one time, and the Atlanta audience was very mannerly and quiet, and he's, the public schools, healthcare, and he said, and SEC football is overrated. Well, there was an explosion. You've gone too far. But this is a classic kind of view, unmediated, no resonance of good and bad. It's just like a totally negative portrayal of the South. But I think that the Southern, even though in a sense Southern culture is being worn away by the inevitable changes and movements of people in and out of the South and all of that, but I think Southerners certainly continue to embrace aspects of the South, but reimagined and making them more diverse, and new people are coming to the South, and so they're often embracing aspects of Southern culture.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah.
And I could read something now.
Oh yeah, please do.
Okay. So one thing that Jimmy and I talked about when we were thinking about the session is about the ethnic changes in the recent Southern culture and the coming of Latinos. When I asked my friend, the sociologist John Shelton Reed, to tell me what he thought about the future of the South, he said, "Como está, y'all?" And the coming of the Latino immigrants beginning in the early 21st century in such dramatically large measure into the Deep South and the Eastern South, not just the Southwest, it really has provided a changing context for talking and thinking about the South. I mean, what does the Confederate flag mean to Latino? white and black Southerners are arguing bitterly about the symbols and we have new museums of the civil rights movement. The one in Jackson, Mississippi, is the state legislature put up $90 million to support that, and they raised $20 million in private funds. That's a pretty dramatic investment, and there are civil rights museums all across the South. The Lost Cause, which seemed like it was in decline, has been sort of reborn a little bit, although the monuments are coming down. But white and black Southerners, that's their common past that is filled with emotional meaning. That doesn't mean anything to Latinos. That changes the public discourse as time goes on. And it's not just Latinos, it's Southeast Asians, it's people from other parts of Europe and Africa continue to come. Anyway, but I think the passage I wanted to read was about the 21st century South and how food is tied in with all of this. And there's one particular example. My argument is that in the 21st century, we're having in the South a movement toward a kind of hybrid culture that draws from past examples of Southern culture, but also injects new influences, and Foodways is a great way to talk about it. And what I want to read is about a cookbook author named Sandra Gutierrez, who's from North Carolina. She has a cookbook called The New Southern Latino Table that was published in 2011. She describes the contours of this new hybridity and places it as a part of Southern living. Her story is just one example of the cultural diversity that's developed. Gutierrez born in the United States of Latin American parents, Gutierrez moved to Guatemala, her parents' native country, when she was a child, and was instantly immersed in a world of melded cultures. She knew the words to two national anthems, the pledges of allegiance to the U.S. flag and the Guatemalan banner, and the histories of two nations. Attending an American school in Guatemala City, she ate in a school cafeteria that served hamburgers and tuna salad one day, and enchiladas and milanesas on the next. She sees that the family's home cooking was also a reflection of my fused reality. We ate tamales for special occasions, huevos rancheros for birthdays, and Carolina hot dogs every chance we got. Each day brought discovery of new Southern dishes as well, and she captured her emerging blended culture in language. As she writes, her family motto became "Hola all," a good verbal expression for an emerging Creole identity. Her summary statement is that Southern food found my soul. This last term, a spiritual one long associated with Southern living. She learned the light touch in making biscuits, discovered grits, and came to savor fried green tomatoes and pimento cheese. The Latina discovered her Southern belle within, and it was magic for me. Well, she's not necessarily typical at all of Latino immigrants, many of whom are working class and have not received a warm welcome in the South. But she's a middle-class person who is reflecting about this identity that she has and seeing that it's a hybrid identity. And to me, this is a metaphor for what is happening in the South in the 21st century.
I think we're at time. Well, that might be a good place to end it. I really appreciate this opportunity to be up here with Charles Wilson. It's always so much fun. And I'm sorry I wasn't watching the time, but I didn't give us enough time for Q&A, but Dr. Wilson will be here afterwards. So if you have any questions for him, you absolutely feel free to come there.
And signing books.
And signing books. Oh, that's right. And he has to go sign books too. So thank you all for coming. This has been great.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Thank you. Cool.